I think we're going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar. We appreciate your patience as we're starting just a minute or two after the start time, but we've been allowing some folks to trickle in. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Natasha Lamoureux. I'm the coordinator for the Global Community of Practice on Women, Peace, Security, and Humanitarian Action at UN Women. And I want to welcome you all to today's online workshop on gender, truth-telling, and institutional reform, taking place today, Thursday, the 23rd of July, 2020. This webinar is being recorded for later playback, and that recording will be made available on the DCAF website. Before we get started, I want to go over just a few housekeeping issues. During this webinar, we have all attendees' microphones muted. If you're having any technical issues during the webinar, please use the chat feature and send myself, Natasha, or Vincenzo Vlad a message, and we will try to address your question as soon as possible. Each discussion will have a brief Q&A session. If you would like to ask a question during the Q&A session, please use the Q&A feature for this, and we will share those questions with the panelists for their response. This webinar is coordinated through UN Women's Global Community of Practice on Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action in collaboration with our excellent partners at DCAF, the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance. As I said, the recording for this webinar will be made available on the DCAF website, as well as UN Women's internal Community of Practice intranet page. If you have any questions about this webinar, once again, please feel free to send me a chat, and I will do my best to respond to you as soon as possible. This session comes out of our joint collaboration on the Gender and Security Toolkit. And I want to thank again our collaborators from DCAF and the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights for the excellent collaboration on that Gender and Security Sector Toolkit. I would now like to introduce our facilitator for today's webinar, Dr. Amrita Kapoor, Project Coordinator at Gender and Security Division of DCAF. Amrita, feel free to take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Natasha, for kicking us off. And on behalf of UN Women and DCAF, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome all of you from around the world. We have almost 300 who registered to join me in this conversation with a panel of true experts on the topic gender, truth-telling and institutional reform. So by way of introduction, as Natasha mentioned, this is one of a series that comes from the Gender and Security Toolkit published earlier this year, which builds on the last decade of experience to understand how to integrate gender and promote gender equality and why this matters to the work of security and justice actors, including police, justice professionals, the armed forces, the intelligence sector, and parliamentarians, just to name a few. These messages apply broadly, and our online discussions explore how they might assist in navigating emerging challenges. And so that brings us to the impetus for today's conversation, which stems from the recent events following the death of George Floyd in the US. And we see in the last month that this has ignited and reignited calls for truth-telling and reconciliation and for institutional reform, not just of the police, but of the broader justice system, highlighting how the two are intertwined, but also how they might mutually reinforce each other. And what we've seen in the past month or so is also an acknowledgement that confronting structural racism or lack of effective governance and accountability of institutions more broadly requires a reckoning with the multifaceted causes and contributors that trace back generations. So just last month, a bill was introduced into the US Congress to establish, remarkably for the first time in US history, a National Commission on Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, to examine the effects of slavery, institutional racism, and discrimination against people of colour, and how that history impacts laws and policies today. So what we do know, and what we'll hear more about today, is that the meta-narratives produced by truth-telling are foundational for effective institutional reform, In the US, as in other countries, this is particularly the case where police reform is at the eye of the storm because of the embedded culture of impunity surrounding violations of human rights perpetrated against particular disenfranchised groups. So what this means is we can't hope to encourage a police culture of respecting rights if we don't understand the full effects of the current culture and practices on the lived experiences of all individuals, and particularly those who are most vulnerable to abuse and the least able to access justice or remedies. And so we come to gender. Integrating an intersectional gender analysis is critical to understanding the barriers and opportunities to better respond to the diverse needs of all communities. And what does this mean in practice? It means recognizing that gender, in combination with other characteristics such as race, age, ethnicity, religion, disability, sexual orientation, and others, all affects people's experiences of systematic violations of human rights and violence, and their security and justice needs in the response to that violence or to prevent that violence. So we need any truth-telling or attempt to trace the complex historical contributors of systemic violence and lack of governance to integrate a gender perspective, both to understand the full scope of harm and to rebuild a security sector, or more specifically a police force that is sensitive, responsive, and effective at meeting the needs of diverse groups. And there are lessons to be learned from many contexts around the world, and how best to do this, both in terms of truth-telling and institutional reform. So that's what we're going to explore today. We have an incredible panel of experts. And to achieve a conversation flow rather than panels, and just to reiterate what Natasha said, we welcome questions either to one panel member or to the panel at large through the Q&A screen. And we'll be asking these questions at the end of the 4 topics that we'll explore today. We'll also accept very short comments that describe a relevant good practice through the Q&A screen. And we're going to invite panel members to respond to each other in the spirit of having an engaging conversation. So let me please introduce the panel members. I'll introduce all 4 of them before I ask the first question. So firstly, Ibtihel Abdellatif, who's the chair of the Women's Committee on the Tunisian Truth and Dignity Commission, known as the IVD. I first met Ibtihel just after the IVD was established, and the concept of a Women's Committee was first and controversially raised. After 5 years of operation, the IVD report was published in March last year. So Ibtihel brings an incredible depth of practical and political experience navigating the entire journey of integrating gender from the very beginning to the end of a truth commission. Welcome, Ibtihel. Second, Professor Brandon Hamber, the John Hume and Thomas P. O'Neill Chair of the Peace International Conflict Research Institute at Ulster University. Brandon has been thinking about and researching the different facets of gender and transitional justice contexts for decades, and very valuably for this conversation has analysed how concepts of masculinity are critical to not only understanding why and how violations are committed, but also to effective reform. Nowhere is that more obvious than the frequently hyper-masculine culture of the police force, as exemplified in the stories we've seen from the US from former police officers around the culture that exists within the police membership. So welcome, Brandon. Farah Tanis is the executive director of an NGO, the Black Women's Blueprint. I will always be incredibly grateful for the invitation to meet with Farah back in 2014 when she began leading the process of creating a rare NGO Truth Commission dedicated to understanding and tracing the historical narrative of Black women's experiences of sexual assault in the US. It was my privilege to then be invited as a Truth Commissioner and bear witness to the innovative, creative, and deeply nurturing truth-telling experience that the Black Women's Blueprint created, and which has been a platform for advocacy around many forms of justice, including institutional reform. Welcome, Farah. Yasmin Sooka, Chair of the UN Commission of Human Rights in South Sudan, as well as a former Truth Commissioner for the South African TRC and the Sierra Leonean TRC. Yasmin, you almost need no introduction. With an extraordinary career spanning two landmark truth commissions and another commission on human rights and also an extraordinary mandate and groundbreaking mandate. So there's no chance we'll be able to discuss even a fraction of the depth of your expertise, but we'll do our best. Welcome, Yasmin. So let's turn to the first question, and we're going to start maybe with Yasmin, with you, looking back. We see that the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission was an extraordinary landmark, and there are many lessons that we've learned from that experience, not just broadly, but specifically in relation to gender. And what does it take to really elicit those gender sensitive narratives and get the full picture of violations when certain victims and certain victims speaking about particular violations may not feel comfortable. So could you perhaps share with us some of the key lessons from the South African experience on the gender dimension and how this contrasted to your experience in Sierra Leone?
Sorry, I had to remember to unmute. Thank you very much for the question. I'm sure many people won't know that, in fact, what was quite remarkable about the South African Truth Commission is that the word gender, or the idea of gender, was not included in its mandate. And in fact, this was quite extraordinary given the fact that at the same time that the law was being negotiated, during the negotiations, women across different political backgrounds got together to demand a space at the negotiating table. And that, of course, led to quite remarkable equality legislation, but also the notion of a 1/3 representation in almost all of the negotiating teams, but also the future parliament. And so the South African Truth Commission, once it was established, was approached really by a number of women's groups. And those women's groups asked the question, does truth have a gender? And in fact, they literally demanded that the commission begin to incorporate a gendered approach into its work. And I think that because it was at the very beginning, we were able to do so. And that, of course, included strategies of ensuring that in the way in which documentation was going to be done, it would be disaggregated data that would be collected. We also, because of the focus, included women, particularly in statement taking, documentation, the analysis, all of those things. But I have to say that it was not an easy battle, because there were many in the commission and outside of the commission who in fact did not believe that gender was an important issue to focus on. And this contrasts, I think, remarkably with what I believe is probably one of the better commissions in the world that have dealt with this question of incorporating a gender perspective, understanding that it's important in the construction of the historical narrative to really bring up the voices of the invisible. And that, of course, I think is why the Sierra Leonean Commission was so important, because one was able to do what we couldn't do in South Africa, and that is incorporate both a policy, a range of strategies to document the experiences of both men and women, boys and girls, and also to look at the way in which the conflict affected them differently. And this is really important because it links to that big role that is, how does the commission not just lift those voices, but also how does it ensure that in future, looking to the future in terms of its recommendations, how does it begin to improve not just the plight of women, but also of men? And I think that, most truth commissions in interpreting this question of gender have really focused on the question of discrimination and equality rights. And most of them have tended to look, I think, at the question also of sexual violence or conflict-related sexual violence. But I think that in the work that we are doing now, and that's the evolution really of mandates, it's also beginning to understand that, the cliches that we used to use, that rape is a weapon of war only in respect of women, is something that we've also begun to change. And I think what we understand is the way in which sexual violence has become weaponized as a tool against those who are regarded as different or other. And I think that's part of the evolution of what we have done. But it's an important focus because at the end of the day, it is about human security and ensuring that people really are able to claim not just their right to dignity and freedom, but also the question of the full rights of citizenship. And I think that's what you're beginning to see in the battle lines that are being drawn in the United States around the question of Black Lives Matter. It's the structural decades and centuries of exclusion and discrimination based on the question of class. And I think this is an important lesson going forward.
Yeah, thank you, Yasmin. And I think you're absolutely right in tracing that trajectory, even if we think about understandings of gender and gender blindness being the starting point, and then the next stage being, okay, well, now we need to really have women be able to tell their stories, and now a much more sophisticated understanding of gender and the diverse sort of effects of an intersectional gender analysis and response, not just obviously on women and girls, but on men and boys and different, and how that interrelates with other characteristics. And I think that's a really good segue, because, you know, I think that part or that sophistication leads us neatly into Brandon's work. Brandon, you've been looking at this and seeing how we need to understand these different concepts of gender and specifically masculinity, not just to dismantle and understand violations, but also what exactly the redress might be to be effective.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks very much for hosting me this afternoon. I need to apologize in advance. There is some work going on in our house in the background. So if there's a bit of banging, don't be alarmed, but these are the times that we live in now. But thanks very much for the opportunity to be with you all this afternoon. And thanks for the question on masculinities. Yeah, I have been doing a fair bit of work around the issue of masculinities over the last number of years. And I think what's unique about truth-telling processes is what they offer us, first and foremost, is the ability to do complexity, to talk about complex narratives, to talk about challenging situations. And I think that that's quite important when we're thinking about the issue of masculinity. And I always feel when I speak on masculinities, I need to always start with saying what I'm not talking about somehow, rather than what I'm talking about. And so for me, masculinity is not really about where are the men? Why are there not more men in these processes? That's not what we're talking about. What we're really talking about is how do we understand these complex dynamics that exist, often associated with power and with, I suppose, doing maleness. And that's really complex because it varies. There's ways of doing male on the battlefield, on the sports field, in the boardroom, in the nightclub, the metrosexual in the coffee shop. These are all forms of doing different types of masculinities. And so I think we need to firstly recognize that level of complexity. But then when we think about that complexity, one of the challenges with truth-telling processes and transitional justice processes, and Yasmin touched on this too, is we often then tend to think about masculinities in quite a limited way. So we think of the men as perpetrators and the women as victims, which of course is an important component. And there's no doubt that toxic types of masculinities and violent masculinities are an essence of political violence, but they also don't always tell us the full picture. So when I say masculinities, I'm thinking also about how masculinities are performed within the companies that create arms, within the financiers of violence, within our political structures. And so it's not just those very direct acts of violence and the masculine dimensions, but those wider dynamics of masculinity. And in the introduction, for example, you mentioned the police. And, you know, clearly what others have called the cult of masculinities often exists within those structures. So it's not just about saying, how do we, say, prosecute certain individuals, as important as that is, but how do we dismantle some of those cultures, which is what's really, really difficult. And maybe to give an example from the South African process, and Yasmin can talk to this too, if we only focus on direct violations, then there is always risks in limiting our narrative. So in South Africa, for example, there were significantly more women who spoke at the Truth Commission than men. But if you looked at the stories they spoke about men's stories. They didn't really talk about their own complex stories, because we were really looking at violations. We were looking at human rights violations, and men were, the majority of victims in that direct sense were men. So the women were speaking about men rather than their wider context of what it was like to maybe have to bring up a family in a certain context, or having their house raided continually. So for me, that's what I mean by masculinity, is how do we get to that discussion on those complex narratives, on the narratives which are wider than just perpetration and violence. We obviously need to deal with that as well, but look at those complex roles. For example, men as civilians. Most men in conflict are probably civilians. They're not soldiers. So we need to look at soldiers, but we need to understand what are other men doing in those contexts. How are they propping up systems in different ways? And overriding that, really, that idea of what I said, what others have called the cult of masculinity, if we're thinking about policing and institutions like that.
Thank you so much, Ben. And I think I really liked what you were saying in terms of the dismantling of the culture, and how much, and I guess related to truth commissions, how much sort of asking the right questions in the right way can get you answers that underlie the reasons that are not apparent, right? And certainly don't go to just direct violations. One of the examples we have in tool number 2 on gender and police was in fact in Pakistan, which is an incredibly hyper-masculinized and hyper-militarized police context. There was an interesting initiative where an NGO basically partnered with the police to do training that deconstructed masculinity within the police, and got them to question their own assumptions and what it means to be an effective police officer. So again, and we see this resonating with the US, which is this idea of, in fact, you're there to serve the community and to build bridges with the community. And that's the vast majority are going to be, people who are just going about their normal business and not criminals. And we see obviously how that gets blurred in a militarized context. So I think what you're saying is something which resonates not just in sort of a particular context, but across police cultures around the world. And I'm going to turn then to Farah, because I think one of the sort of issues that Black Women's Blueprint confronted, and was the impetus for creating the Truth Commission, was the understanding of how police and security institutions and the government more broadly sort of compound and facilitate the impunity associated. And in your case, you were looking at Black women's experiences of sexual assault. But so could you describe a little bit more about the impetus for creating this Truth Commission, and what you were hoping this type of narrative might contribute to the broader US sort of, reckoning with its past?
And it's just so incredibly important. For us, at Black Women's Blueprint, launching a civil society-led, survivor-led Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for us was groundbreaking. It was a watershed moment. It was absolutely necessary. Black activists, Black Lives Matter activists were pushing for something like this. Black feminists were pushing for something like this to happen, and for those at the margins to take the leadership to make it happen and not depend on the federal government, whom for centuries, had denied that there had been violations against Black women's bodies, that there had been rapes that were not only state-sponsored, but rapes that were part of really promoting and sustaining an economy, right, and really building and propping up capitalism in the United States. So for us, we know this, right, that the U.S. is one of the very few places, as we thought about the Truth Commission and really launching a Black Women's Truth and Reconciliation Commission focused on sexual violence. We knew that in the U.S. that this was one of the very few places in the world where mass rapes and brutal sexual and reproductive labor exploitation, that these things have occurred systematically against an entire race of people. And we're talking about enslaved African women and girls in the US South, Yet we knew that there had been little to no public outcry, no formal governmental processes for recognition, no national process for justice or acknowledgement of such violations, and ongoing, really what we're calling post-war, as we're calling, the enslavement of Black people and the annihilation of Black people and their rights, really a war declared on people of African descent, right? The kidnapping, being taken really as prisoners of war. And people may feel that this is a sort of like a dramatization of it, but that is exactly how, our grandmothers, our great grandmothers describe it, especially during Jim Crow. The mass lynchings, the mass rapes that went unrecognized were seen as a war against Black bodies and against Black people. And so when you think of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, when we thought of it, we knew it initially evolved really from grassroots organizing by survivors of sexual violence, some of whom were 96 years old and had experienced rape throughout their lives in the Jim Crow South, and spoke with their mothers and grandmothers who had been raped, and many of them had been the products of rape, state-sponsored rape in the United States. It began with women and girls in the United States really seeking to organize and to expose what had happened to them. And though these survivors, as survivors, I myself as a survivor, we had done lifelong work to heal. We sought forums to hold state and non-state perpetrators of violence accountable, and the creation of space in which to build not just, power within the US, but many of us who had hailed from other countries, like myself as an immigrant and grown up here, really a way to build transnational power for survivors of state-based and intra-community violence. It was out of those discussions about who we were, how we could do this across our different nationalities living in the US, many of us having been raped and violated inside of the US. It was out of these discussions that the Black Women's Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Sexual Assault was born. And it was in response to the rape, not only to the rape of Black women in the US by members of community, but really by the police, right? Sexual misconduct by police officers within the criminal justice system, even. It's an issue that is constantly being talked about, but not much has been done, and it continues to happen, right? There hasn't really been a truth commission around what happens with women and the rapes that happen with women in custody. But sexual misconduct by police officers or public officials is the second most prevalent form of police crime, as noted by an annual report on the Cato Institute report. So the main objective for creating the Truth and Reconciliation Commission focused on sexual violence was to expose the stories of women and girls whose rights had been violated, in particular the violation of their bodily integrity through rape, sexual assault, forced reproduction of entire generations of enslaved people. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the United States, led by Black women, also highlighted the crucial role that women of African descent could play in countering discrimination and in promoting the full enjoyment, really, of the rights of women of African descent in this country, but really also to set a model or to be in conversation with models being created worldwide by women of African descent. What we hoped is that these women's narratives would broaden this conversation around racial justice, police reform, criminal justice reform, and really add the evidence of racism and of human rights violation and the need for more comprehensive reform and even abolition of the police that is being discussed now, but really center it not only in the narratives or around the paradigm of one, aspect of one segment of our population, which are Black men, but really also equally center it in the lived experiences of Black women and girls.
Great, thank you, Farah. And I think, what you speak of, and in some ways it sort of brings back that emotional residue that people carry with them intergenerationally. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's been so fascinating about truth commissions and the narratives that get explored in this sort of structural examination, is that the effects are intergenerational, and in fact the remedies need to be intergenerational as well. And in fact, what you've covered is essentially that compounding harms when you fail to reckon with that, and when you fail to address that through institutional reform. So, you know, thank you for, I think, highlighting that these are not just stories, but these are lived experiences that people trace back through their families, and that there is a harm from the failure to acknowledge that formally. Before moving on, I just wanted to flag to our participants that Ibtihel is in Tunis and has momentarily lost internet connection, will rejoin us as soon as she can. So I'm going to first invite the panelist members, if there's anything that you'd like to say to each other, or respond, or whether there have been any remarks made that sparked another idea or practice or something you'd like to share with us. And we will, obviously, once Ibtihel returns, we'll give her a chance to speak, but we'll keep moving through the topics in the meantime. So Brandon, Yasmin.
Yeah,
Yasmin, yes,
I think that, you know, what we're talking about is both invisibility and denial. And in fact, historical denial, which has also resulted, I think, in the privilege of many, many groups. And so, you know, what truth commissions do, I think, is at the one level, you kind of amplify the voices of the individual. And in a sense, that's really that right to truth recovery for an individual survivor. But at the end of the day, the real, I think, value of the work of truth commissions is around what I would call the institutional. And that is to begin to unpack how different institutions and cultures have allowed these kinds of exclusions and discrimination, which really amount to very serious crimes, to continue. And so part of the job is in the construction, I think, of the historical narrative, is to lift up the fact that people benefit. And, you know, nobody's innocent in many ways. There are different levels of responsibility, whether you're the policeman who's a direct perpetrator, whether you're the criminal justice system, or whether you're the bystander who benefits from the fact that other people have been enslaved and criminalized. And so I think this is a discussion that the South African Truth Commission touched on a little bit, but didn't deal with properly. And in fact, I think the focus on foot soldiers to the exclusion of those structures and individuals who are responsible for devising these policies, for ensuring that they happen, that they implemented what today we know as command and control responsibility, or even the question of aiding and abetting. And I think unless a Truth Commission begins to unpack those issues, you cannot really lay the basis for the institutional reform, or as we call it in the transitional justice lexicon, really the guarantee of non-recurrence, which is really about how you reclaim your rights as a full citizen, but also your expectation that the state will work for you, irrespective of who you are. And, you know, it resonates as I listen to Farah speaking, you know, listening to just the way in which housing programs in the United States have worked, where the red zoning of districts meant that people could never use their properties as collateral. And that's such a similar story to South Africa, where by 1913, 97% of the land had been taken away from Black people. And even today, they continue to struggle to access title deeds. So I think that unless we deal with this question of the institutional and the structural, we don't really get to the real questions of dismantling the structures, because that's really the important question. How do you dismantle the structures that made that possible? Because those become new conflict drivers in a society.
Thank you, Yasmin. I couldn't have said it better. I agree. And in some ways, that's certainly why in the work that we find most helpful is actually to switch that focus from, for example, women's participation, whether it's in truth-telling or in the police, but actually to say, well, what does it mean to investigate the power structures themselves, and how certain biases will be perpetuated even if there's no conscious directive behind it, 20 years on or 40 years on, that continues to have these effects. Ibtihel, I know that you've just been able to find a stable connection, and so welcome back. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes. No, that's fine. This happens. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes just if you want to explain a little bit about the Tunisian context, and the resistance or challenges that you faced in terms of establishing a women's committee, but also, you know, trying to adopt an intersectional gender approach to the way in which the Truth Commission operated in Tunisia. You'll just need to unmute your microphone as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry again. For us, gender approach in association with transitional justice or gender-based transitional justice refers to the attainment of gender equality with regard to civil, political, economic, and social rights. It also refers to the consolidation of the justice among them, especially for the benefit of women who were subjected to violations of gross and systematic violations. This is because men oftentimes, especially in our countries, manage to benefit from a higher number of rights than women. The latter usually bump into hardships that prevent them from having access to those rights, a situation that consecrates inequality. When designing the procedures and creating the mechanism of transitional justice that do not rely on the gender approach. The Women Committee in the Truth and Dignity Commission was a key and a tool to reach the rights of women and to help, especially to help women, especially that they are in the category. The majority of women are in the category of vulnerable people here in Tunisia. We base it to the specificities of women and in an effort to provide optimal conditions that are likely to ensure their involvement in the process of transitional justice. The Women's Committee has come up with proposals that are variable enough to ensure most appropriate levels of reception, assistance, and protection of women victims whenever they express their desire to come forward with their statements about the violations they had sustained without disclosing their identity. In the beginning of our work, we received only 5% of the whole number were women, and it's very few numbers. And we know if there is one man victims, there is around him at least 4 women victims: his mother, his sisters, his daughter, and his mother. And we face many problems to convince women to submit their files at the beginning. And we did at that moment a strategy to reach them. And after that, we succeeded to receive 25%. It's about 15,000 files and complaints of women. It wasn't easy at all in Tunisia. We had a big strategy. We dealt with the media. We had a strategy with media, and also we had the mobile unit to reach women in rural area, in mountains, and several regions. Every weekend I must travel to different areas and to convince them to speak to them and to convince them. And what convinces them is the guarantee of confidentiality. When we said to them that no one will know that you submitted your files to the TDC, even your husband, your son, no one will know that. When we guarantee to women this confidentiality, And yes, the majority of them accepted. Also, we needed a unit of psychological and social and medical for help for these women. You know, the majority of these women need rehabilitation and reparation. We tried to convince them and to explain to them that the first step to regain their dignity, the first step to have the healing is to submit this file, is to invoice out what this the different violations that they suffer of. Also, we try to convince them that even because the majority also of these women, they said, we lost our lives, but we tried to say to them, you are militant, and now when you invoice, when you will say the truth, you will help us to know all the truth, to dismantle the system of dictatorship, and you will help the other generation. You will protect your children. You will protect the girls and your daughters. That's why they felt they had, the importance of their truth telling, the importance of their stories to help and to rewrite our history. You know, because in Tunisia, for example, and I know in other also countries, women are absent, nearly absent in the history, the militance of women, and that's why we made a big strategy. It wasn't easy, but we need big efforts with medical assistance, psychological assistance. We did many surveys, many questionnaires, and we did the participatory approach with victims to help them and to know how to deal with them. Because, for example, the majority of women want to deal with women. When they came to submit their files, or after in the investigation, when we or in the secret hearing, but we know also we discover also that another category of women prefer also to speak to men and don't want to speak to women, because also they was raped or they were tortured in prison by women. That's why I said that we need to hear in the beginning. We need to hear victims. We need women. We need to hear their association, their organization, and we built our procedures with them. We made at the beginning we made many mistakes. Even also we learned the mistakes or the shortcoming of other experiences. And now also I try as a commissioner to evaluate this strategy. And also I think that we made also many mistakes, and we need to give you this shortcoming or these mistakes that the other experience can learn also from us.
Great, thank you so much, Ibtihel. And you sort of neatly segued into the second topic around the strategies, because your discussion of the mobile units and actually what I think was really interesting is not only how critical confidentiality becomes as a precondition for participation, but also that the motivation for many of these people that you described is not themselves and their own healing, but in fact the effect that it might have on the future generations, which returns to the topic we were just discussing before about the value of truth commissions in not just exposing an intergenerational thread, but in fact recognizing that intergenerational effects need to be addressed as well. And so to hear from you that in fact that's a powerful motivation is, I think, really valuable to understand why it is you might get broader participation when you start thinking about what it is that people really need as a precondition, and then what will convince them or persuade them that it's worth the risk for them. So thank you so much for sharing that. And that sort of goes into the topic 2, which was around looking at strategies. And it also relates to a question that we've received on the topic of masculinity. Particularly in certain contexts, we see that toxic masculinity, such as in a country like Afghanistan, is very taboo. It's difficult to speak about, and there are strong traditional Islamic and tribal underpinnings. And so this question is first directed to Brandon, but I will open it up to the rest of the panel. And Brandon, it does put you on the spot a little, because the question is, are there any tips to discuss the elephant in the room, right? How do we broach the topic of toxic masculinities in these types of cultures? And obviously it goes directly to the point of strategies that we might be able to use, not just in Afghanistan, but obviously more broadly as well.
Well, thank you for that question, and there isn't really an easy answer to it, and I certainly am not an expert on Afghanistan or the culture in Afghanistan, so I can't really comment on that directly. Maybe my answer is a little bit academic, but the way that I've always spoken about this, and many others have spoken about it too, is it's really important to emphasize the continuities and the discontinuities in terms of masculinities. And because toxic masculinities and violent masculinities are so dominant, it is very easy to fall into only thinking about those types of masculinities. But in any culture, I have no doubt you will find a whole range of different types of masculinities. And the question is, how do we find the room and space to emphasize some of the other approaches and other ways of doing maleness, if we want to call it that, in different societies? So it's not a very direct answer, but I do think that's one of the tasks. One of the tasks is to accentuate the differences that actually exist. You know, and in certain parts of society, we've managed to do that. So, you know, by able to sort of on the sports field accentuate that there can be gay men playing certain sports which are associated with sort of quite hyper, say rugby, quite a hyper form of masculinity. By doing that, you can emphasize that there are multiple forms of masculinity. Now, I'm not saying that that necessarily bumps onto thinking about violent masculinities in really difficult contexts. But the short answer is we need to demonstrate these competing masculinities as much as possible. It's very hard often for governments to do that, and that's where civil society is often really key in being able to demonstrate that, being able to give space to different groups within the sort of public realm.
I'd like to also add to that. I agree with you 100%, Brandon, and we're constantly talking about this. And I think for a while, Black feminists in the United States have been talking about this issue of masculinity, but how it exists and functions within patriarchal society, right? So it's one thing to say, you know, for us, we look at it as we look at racism or white supremacy. It's one thing to say, oh, well, there are different ways that white people or white persons engage with people of color. There are different ways in which white persons show up in persons of color spaces or in systems, that they are gatekeepers that open doors and give jobs and practice in a way where they foreground equality. I think within a system and a structure and a society that privileges whiteness, within a structure and a system where whiteness and those who are white are in the rule, they make the rules, they make the policy. We as people of color are the minority. It almost becomes impossible to, I would say, eradicate white supremacy in the ways that we know it needs to be eradicated. I feel that it's the same for male violence, for example, for male domination, for cultures of domination, for, you know, even toxic masculinity. I think highlighting and promoting and demonstrating that there are good masculinities can temporarily remedy the issue, can provide a different model for people to choose to follow or not. But I think a deeper conversation needs to be had, and maybe more radical sort of communities need to be created, which are led by women or which are equally led, right? Where we're modeling this sort of reciprocity and mutuality and a going back to what many of us really, there's a movement, I think, around the world that is growing towards rematriation, right? And I know this probably is not the time to bring this up. However, there are matriarchal societies that are saying we need to begin to raise our sons differently. And yes, we will exist within this broader world that is a patriarchal world, but how do we create our own villages where we can then show and demonstrate that you can raise sons? 20 years later, here is my son who was raised in a matriarchal society, and his way of thinking, the ideologies, his way of practicing gender is incredibly different. And in fact, he's the one you want in power because he understands the world, and his worldview is so different that masculinity to him was informed by the ways in which he sat with women, he experienced women, he engaged with women, and the ways in which he was taught. And so there isn't this deprogramming that would need to happen now with men who are raised in patriarchal society. But you know, I just wanted to bring that up as really a new way of thinking, right? I mean, we are dreaming. When we talk about truth commissions, it had to be dreamt up before it could be manifested. When we talk about new ways of practicing masculinity, we have to dream up a world where patriarchy is not the rule, you know, is not the way of being, where there is shared power. And so I just want to say that. We'll talk more about that later and how we're implementing that ourselves at Black Women's Blueprint, but
no, thanks, Farah. I mean, this is what this conversation dynamic is for, is to be able to sort of surface these different options and how we might imagine that. Yasmin, I note that you had unmuted yourself. So did you want to chip in, please?
Yeah, I mean, I did, you know, I was part of a team that did a lot of training in Afghanistan with the Human Rights Commission. And this was just, I think, around 2005 or 7. And it was a moment when that could still happen. And I was struck by, you know, what the Human Rights Commission was dealing with, the fact that women didn't have a value, and a man valued his dog more than he valued a woman. And so part of a bet would often involve trading the women that he thought belonged to him as a piece of property for something that he'd lost or won in a gamble. And of course, I think that we have to look at, you know, these are not easy conversations to have in very patriarchal societies, but they are of immense importance because it does affect the future and the next generation. But we also have to look at it in the context of societies that breed violence, structural violence, because unless you understand that context, you can't actually deal with you know, the problem. And in South Africa, of course, I mean, this is one of the untold stories, I think, of the work of the Truth Commission, that you'd have a man who was a freedom fighter, but at night he would go home and beat his wife. And, you know, when we spoke to women across the board, many of them who held very high positions in government and in different spaces, they would say to you, this is what happened to me, but I'm not going to allow you to print it. And so one of the untold stories, I think, is of this question of, I would say, structural violence, in which sexual violence becomes part of the weapon of how men exercise masculinity. And you know, if you look at South Africa today, it's one of those countries which has the highest record of violence against women in the world. And in many ways, I think it's because we missed that opportunity to really deal with it. And that is why, you know, when we talk about truth commissions adopting a gendered approach, it has to be intersectional, but it also has to be willing to confront what I think are discomforting truths. I think some of that discussion is beginning to happen in the United States as well, that you cannot separate violence on one level from violence at another level. And so I think we need to look at the context that breeds that kind of violence, but we also need to think about how do we bring up both men and women in a way in which patriarchy is addressed. And one of the things I want to say is that, in my view, and I've said this in the context of South Sudan, You cannot deal with sexual and gender-based violence and masculinities without dealing with accountability. And accountability may take many different forms, but for those who are at the highest level, there must be criminal accountability and some sort of sanction, because without that, you have no incentive really to behave differently. And then, of course, I think the other question is education. And what's the incentive really for, and this is something that was also interesting about Afghanistan. At that point, when you had the whole of the international community there, you had many young women who could speak English. And because of that, they became the interlocutors or the navigators for really preserving the economic framework in a household. And so many men who would normally insist that these women can't go out without a mahram or somebody, a guardian, they would allow these women to go to work because this was the only way that the family was surviving. And so there was a direct correlation between women being able to exercise their rights linked to the question of economic power. And so in my view, I think those three questions, the unpacking of the invisible patriarchy, but also the question of education, accountability, and the incentive may be ways in which we can actually shift the paradigm in many societies in which this is quite endemic.
Thank you, Yasmin. Yes, I agree. And I think what's interesting about this discussion is obviously we're following one thread and we're really pulling out how so many of these other issues are interrelated. And again, how that sort of meta-narrative needs to encompass them all to be able to feed into some change that's actually meaningful, not just in a, as Farah was saying, in a more superficial level, but something which is much more foundational. And potentially, a reimagining. Brandon, I know that you wanted to add on to this as well, please.
Oh, thanks. No, it's a really fascinating discussion, and I just wanted to maybe add one or two quick things. I mean, maybe some of it is similar to Yasmin's view, that I think if we want to tackle these issues, and Yasmin used those words as well, I mean, we have to look at complicity and responsibility. And if we think of, because I didn't really comment on it in the early part of the discussion, but if we think of slavery and colonialism, of course, these are about exploitation, power, racism, economic extraction, but they're fundamentally masculinized structures. And they're masculinized structures in which whole communities became complicit in making them run and operate. And that has been the world that most of us have grown up in for centuries, literally. So the job that we have to do when we're thinking about that is quite a massive job. And I guess what I'm trying to emphasize in my work is, yes, we need to focus on the men with guns and the police reform, and Yasmin is right about accountability and those issues, but it is also that much wider picture that is of concern. And we've seen it in so many societies, in Northern Ireland, many others, South Africa to a degree as well. You trade in your gun for a suit at the end of the peace process, and then you just operate in another form of masculinized way of taking control of that society. And so for me, that's the main thread of what I'm interested in of late. And then I just really wanted to just share what Farah said about imagination. And I've been writing about this recently in some of my work, that I think when it comes to masculinities, we really lack a sense of what that imagination is. And part of that, again, because of the dominance of white culture, is the way that we then think about a new form of masculinity is influenced by heterosexual Western culture. So in South Africa, when we did research asking men about the new equality agenda, they tended to reject the agenda. And when we asked them what was that about, they'd say, oh, since the transition in South Africa, women have now more power and we've lost our job and we're no longer the breadwinners, which actually historically is not always true, because a lot of the households were actually run by women. But they've basically adopted an imagination that, the nuclear family in the sort of Western sense of the word is what they should be somewhere aspiring to. And then when we think about changing those masculinities, what do we think about that? We think about that in the sort of very Western way of the sort of man who knows his own sense of his emotions, you know, the sort of metrosexual man having a cup of coffee in Starbucks, you know, is somehow becomes the aspiration of what a more gender sensitive masculinity is. And I think that there's something else. I don't know what it is. But what I'm trying to say is I think even our imagination of what is a more sensitive masculinity is sort of a white Western idea of a sensitive form of masculinity. And that's why it's not going to work in Afghanistan, and it's not going to work in South Africa, and it's not going to work all over the world, because actually we have to find new cultures of masculinities that speak to those cultural resonances and not to this sort of historical whiteness of even how we think of reformed masculinities.
Thank you, Brandon. And again, I guess, you know, what we saw this decades ago, even with the conversation around feminism and this idea of Western feminism. And because we've already come across the example of Afghanistan, I mean, that was a really, you know, poster example of the sort of ignoring and the oversight of Muslim and Afghan forms of feminism that pre-existed the white form of feminism, and what does it mean to save these women in Afghanistan. And I think similarly, you know, when you're looking at, you know, adopting an intersectional analysis, it is about interrogating what could masculinity look like in these different cultural contexts in a way that is embedded in sort of a traditional continuity or surfaces. You know, we see that there are a hierarchy of masculinities. Can we find others within the context rather than making these assumptions? And I think, you know, you were talking about that, we've sort of spanned from the sort of structural and institutional to the mindset. And I just wanted to draw that link, I guess. A lot of the work that I've done is with the institutions, so with justice professionals, prosecutors, judges, police officers. And I think one, of course, of the challenges in terms of gender and challenging these narratives that are taken for granted is in fact that we can't expect the mindset to change that quickly. And in some ways, that's where the accountability is so important, is that if it's done institutionally. I mean, I've had blunt conversations where I say, look, you know, this may be your culture. You know, to literally, as a police officer in your community, the way you find a wife is you chase her and then you have sex with her, and that's the way that you form the relationship. And I said, well, as a police officer, you have these obligations. And so whatever you might believe and that mindset, the way that you act in your office has to be consistent with these. And I think I agree, Yasmin, that accountability has to be embedded in the structures if we're going to expect these government representatives to do something different. And then in the meantime, we have to reimagine and re-educate, and Farah, as you were saying, you know, look at different ways of bringing children up in order to be able to start that intergenerational process. So just to highlight, I think it's a big gap between the sort of macro criminal accountability that might act as a deterrence and a way of regulating people's behavior to this gradual shift in mindset of what, you know, often what we're talking about is a huge part of the population that believes that this is the expectation as well. So if we can then sort of maybe link this to the institutional reform a bit more closely, and I will sort of go back to Yasmin, you'd already flagged this idea of accountability and the structural aspect, because the Sierra Leonean Truth Commission was, you know, had these remarkable recommendations that stemmed from a gender analysis around the pre-existing structural gender inequality that fueled and facilitated the types of sexual violence that women and girls experienced. And the recommendations included a reform of the legal framework, and the three sort of key laws were not just about violence against women, but also about property inheritance and also about marriage rights. And that these are part of dismantling that system. And so I wanted to ask you whether there were other ways in which the Sierra Leonean sort of gender analysis and the recommendations that flowed from that analysis have fed into institutional reform, or perhaps have not, but there were opportunities for that to happen.
Thank you for the question. You know, what was interesting about Sierra Leone was the fact that, and I think this goes to the question of strategies as well, that partnerships are important. And so, you know, the Commission was able to have a very good partnership with what was then UNIFEM, but has become UN Women now. And, you know, as a result of that, we were able to deploy two, I think, really incredible women, feminists, activists, who went out to speak to women across communities, Binaifa Noriji and Betty Muringi, who had both been involved at that time with the ICTR around the Akayesu case. You know, they'd brought that amicus brief to have rape recognized as a weapon of war. And, you know, what I found very interesting in Sierra Leone was that the women were very conscious of the fact that if they needed to change the way in which the structural violence affected them, they would need legal reform. And so what the women asked for, in fact, was that whether or not they were married by traditional or customary rights or Islamic law, that they should be able to benefit from the Constitution. And of course, there was that amendment of the Constitution to ensure that women were able to have their legal rights protected. I mean, the other question, of course, that came with that was the right to have custody of their children, and of course, to be able to inherit property. But another one that was really interesting was the question of education. You know, in most cultures around the world, the education of boys is prized. And so if you have money, the first thing you're going to do is make sure that boy children are educated. And in Sierra Leone, what the women said is, you've got to get the government to agree that girls who go to secondary education don't have to pay school fees. And so we found ourselves in this extraordinary position where we were negotiating with the World Bank around the HIPIC program, so that a certain percentage of those funds would be preserved for girls' schooling. Another issue was, you know, the sort of peace building fund, making sure that a portion of that would go to reparations. But I think one of the most important contributions that the Commission made was to this question of citizenship. You know, in Sierra Leone, you can only claim citizenship if you are the child of two people who are Sierra Leoneans. And so the moment a woman married outside of that, her child would not be able to claim that. And so one of the things we did in the report is we talked about the need really for a new culture of equitable citizenship to promote really a new loyalty and patriotism in Sierra Leone. And we said that a renewed citizenship would require a new culture of new mutual respect and tolerance, really. And I have to say that that was one of the most important laws that was passed subsequently by the government, this new citizenship law, which embraced the fact that, and you know, you can imagine what that meant for women who had been raped, because remember, a lot of the armed forces that came to Sierra Leone came from Liberia. And so those children would automatically be excluded from having any kind of right. And, you know, this was one of the really terrible things in Sierra Leone, that if you had a child that had been born from a rape, the stigma was so great that you could never go back home. And so in many ways, this is one of the things that the Commission really wanted to address. But it does raise that, you know, commissions have an important advisory role. And, you know, one of the things we also have to look at is how do you build an institutional environment and framework for, because commissions are, you know, short bodies in a quick space of time. And so you've got to build the relationships which allow civil society to actually pick those battles up, because these things take between 5 and 10 years to achieve. And so that really raises this question of partnerships, but also relationship building with a multiple layer of actors who can become the advocates for this kind of new society that you envisage. So I think Sierra Leone did quite well. And if you look back, I mean, you just think around the question of law reform, the right to inherit land, to own land, the right to inherit, all of these were achieved, I think, because of the work of the Truth Commission.
Great, thank you for that. And I think, you know, it's obviously all of those effects are interrelated as well. And we're going to sort of in some ways cross that bridge, and I'll ask you, Ibtihel, because obviously the context in Tunisia is very different. It wasn't an armed conflict context. It wasn't the same nature of motivations in terms of the violations that were committed. But if you could, in sort of combining topic 3 and 4, if you could share a little bit about the types of gender sensitive recommendations that came from the Truth Commission in Tunisia, and how that relates to the institutional reform that you'd like to see happen, because of course it's still very early days in your case. And you need to unmute your microphone if you can. Perfect.
Okay. In our work, we faced many challenges. You know, we faced a silence of women, volunteer silence, and forced silence. It wasn't easy at all. There is women who want to forget what happened for them, especially the sexual abuse. And there is women who were forced by their families, not only men, even women, mothers, and even and especially children. We met many children, youth, who refused that their mother speak, and they and to give their stories and what. That's why we think that we need to change all the mentality of our society, not only to put laws. It's we need to change the education, cultural book, to have to participate in arts, you know, to make piece of theaters. We need to put a strategy for youth, for the new generation. And they're, you know, people in Tunisia are well educated, and they have a high quality. They're better than of all the other Arabic countries. But also we face this silence or many taboos, and that's why we need to change mentality for this. We made many, of course, recommendation, and we try to take this recommendation also from victims, not only from us as commissioners or from organizations, of course. And we participated when we were working. We participated in the law and creating the law against women. There is an organic law in Tunisia. We participated in it before even the recommendation. We tried to go to the parliament and to explain what happened for women, especially by political violence, and to make the terms of rape more wide, because it isn't like in Tunisia, it isn't like the international law. And we tried to try to help them, to give them the many other sorts of violations, like rapes by sharp, many other tools. Sorry. This is and we tried, and we helped this law to be created. Also, now you know the parity in Tunisia, parity between men and women in many institutions, and that helps a lot to protect the rights of women. To have women in every institution, in the election, in the parliament, in every institution, that helps to understand women, to help their to understand their needs. Now, in our recommendation, of course, as I said, there is not only as I said, not only laws, but how to change, how to rewrite the history, how to change the mentality by the education, and to tell them and to try to explain for children, also for the new and for the students, what happened in the dictatorship on these women. Children and youth must respect these women and change the mentality that they are partner of the perpetrators. You know, we must they must understand that they are victims, and to respect them and to be proud of these women. They are militant. Now, of course, there is many other structural recommendations like how to do rehabilitation for these women. We need institutions to rehabilitate women and their children, the family, or all tortured who suffered from torture. How to help victims to be active and not to live as a victim, and how to change, how to be active in the society, how to integrate. Of course, all the women have the right to work, have the right to the access to the to have the health, and also we gave the right. All women have all victim women have the right to go to the court and to do accountability for the perpetrators. And of course, we submit many files that we investigated it to the special court, because also this is a step of to regain their dignity, and to guarantee the non-repetition of these violations on women.
Thank you. And I think the non-repetition and the non-recurrence links back to, Yasmin, what you were saying earlier. And of course, we can see that when you look at the institutional reform that you're talking about, when you're looking at history and education, what you're doing is actually saying we need to change the narrative of the past now, so that we understand in the future how we need to change, and that there's an impetus there. And I think this relates a little bit to Farah, what you've been saying. When you don't have this acknowledged, then it means that 20 years, 40 years, 60 years on, there is a denial. And Yasmin, you mentioned invisibility and denial as these two complementary concepts, because it's possible to do that, because the narrative exists. And I think I'm going to sort of narrow down a little bit more into the institutional side. And but even if we look at the police narrative, you know, what are the narratives that exist that tolerate and encourage a certain attitude around what is acceptable within the culture? And certainly that is then coupled with a lack of governance, right, and a lack of of oversight mechanisms that are effective. And it's certainly, you know, that's only possible when there isn't a narrative that's been established that is more inclusive and recognises the complexity of that past. Brandon, I'd just like to invite you to share some examples that you might have found where these types of understandings from truth narratives have informed institutional reform, or if you'd like to speak more specifically to the police and the criminal justice system as well. Can we see these links or possibilities in different contexts?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think when it comes to masculinities directly, it's quite hard to find examples, other than you cited some earlier ones in terms of NGOs. You know, you see, for example, in the Peruvian Truth Commission, quite a good analysis about masculinities and how they fed the violence, but it's quite hard to follow that with sort of direct recommendations. But I have seen some examples in terms of institutional reform that maybe not flow directly from changing the narrative, but at least altering the narrative. And probably the best example I could think of there would be in Northern Ireland, where I'm based, which would be the Patton report following the 1998 agreement. And that report makes 175 recommendations. Some of them are practical and some of them are symbolic, like renaming of the Royal Ulster Constabulary to the police service, much more focus on sort of district policing structures and community policing structures, changing of some symbols, a raft of oversight mechanisms, moving towards 50-50 recruitment of Catholic and Protestant community. Now, I'm not saying this is a perfect process, because there are many people who would contest that it was perfect in many ways. But actually, recently there was a piece of research carried out by Jessica Doyle and Monica McWilliams. Monica's based with us at Ulster University. And what was interesting about that research is it actually focused on domestic violence, and so not so much on political violence. But what was fascinating about it is that they actually found that, and they linked it to the reform of the policing process in Northern Ireland, that actually the proportion, particularly of people from the Catholic community, but also generally of women who are willing to report domestic violence, they did a study in 1992, then they followed it up in 2016, increased quite dramatically over that period. So as the police reformed, people actually did develop a much greater sense of trust, particularly women in the police. And for example, 44%, there was a decrease of 44% in the proportion of participants who described the police as not helpful, which is quite a significant change. Now, that was partly about changing trust in the police, but partly also about retraining. And many of people in Northern Ireland, and including the police, would now complain that they're overly regulated. But clearly that overregulation has meant that they're more likely to follow up on arrests, on issuing cautions, and so on and so forth. So it's quite a positive story. I mean, the other part of that that they talked about was the demobilizing of paramilitaries has also had a positive effect, because many men, either through real or fictitious connections to paramilitaries, would use that as a way of controlling their intimate partners. So they were able to sort of show the sort of structural change, and the more gradual change within the police, which again is not perfect, has actually changed the reporting structures of the way women who've experienced intimate partner violence might come before the police. And I think that sort of what also proved their point to some degree is from their 1992 study to their 2016 study, they didn't find the same changes, for example, in how people viewed general practitioners and how they viewed social workers. So actually, their view of general practitioners not picking up on intimate partner violence, and of social workers maybe being overly focused on child protection, that didn't change as dramatically as some of people's views on police. So in reading that report, I was quite encouraged that actually even a police reform process you wouldn't say was perfect, but where you see that reform process happening, they were able to articulate that, say, on something like intimate partner violence, that you could actually see some changes. So it's not my research, it's their research, Jessica Doyle and Monica McWilliams, but I found it quite encouraging.
Thank you. And I'm just going to sort of build off that, because I think what's interesting is obviously not just having something set up to monitor the change, but also to have the evidence base from the beginning. And sort of one of the interesting aspects of the work that we do is look at institutions, whether it's armed forces or the police service. And we have a guide to a self-assessment, a guide to a gender self-assessment. And it can be applied to the whole range of security and justice institutions. But what's interesting about that methodology is that it gives you an evidence-based, including from surveys across the service, and we've got one in one country where the survey's been delivered to over 100,000 police officers. So you're getting an enormous amount of data and evidence on the full range of performance and attitudes around gender. But I think what's interesting is the self-assessment part means that there's institutional ownership of the data. And that means that you have some buy-in around where are the areas that you need to reform most urgently. And it also makes it, if you want to be cynical, a bit harder to ignore those areas. And so I think in some ways, and this, you know, this is obviously conditional on the institution itself being willing to have that level of self-reflection. But I think where there's a political moment, and I think, Brandon, you're describing that was the case in Ireland, is that it was a particular political moment to be able to make this move forward. And we see that that's often the case, that political window may only last for a period of time. Or in Sierra Leone, we saw that political window for the gender laws didn't come for another decade. So we don't know exactly when that link might be made, but I think what's incredible is that evidence base, whether it comes from a self-assessment of the institution or from a truth commission, is one that allows you to take advantage when that political moment is here. So on that note, I'm going to sort of let you all have a last minute or two, because we've run to the end of our time. And sort of get you to Farah look going forward when we talk about how do we make that shift, because the US, unlike the other contexts that we've been discussing, is at the beginning of that. But what does it mean to integrate gender into police reform and justice reform in the US? What does that look like?
I think for us, you know, we always balance a need for state and systems reform with transformation, which needs to happen inside our communities, right? Sort of like at the grassroots level, where we are constantly building power, right? We believe power sits with us. Really, it's only a matter of how we look at it and how we move and how we shape and shift the discourse, the course and the discourse around power to recenter the margins. And so because of the complexities of racism and advocacy efforts that have always, I mean, really just solely been informed by a paradigm centering men's experiences with criminal justice violence, including police, coupled with this over-reliance on carceral systems by advocates, we've had to push and develop an affirmative vision for justice that decenters masculinist ideologies. So we have been in the feminist movements, the Black feminist movement, intersectional feminism movements. We've been furthering non-carceral approaches where survivors of violence, for example, can name harm and have it addressed inside of our communities. It is very complex. It's going to require an incredible amount of resources and effort. It's going to require that we work together with men and people of various genders to do this. We have been advancing community-centered approaches to ending violence and fostering harm reduction as an affirmative vision of justice that enables having harm addressed by those of us who experience it. But when we think of the Black Women's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you know, the vision that we set forth, what we had hoped that it would accomplish, and what we actually, you know, have had some successes in, is that one of our demands, we wanted to provide a blueprint for community mobilization so that the US and in its political transition in particular, because we culminated the TRC in 2016, right? We wanted to, and that was the transition between Obama and Trump, that we wanted to, under this administration, which obviously has failed, right? We wanted this administration to keep its commitment to survivors, right, of what the World Health Organization, you know, is calling the most pervasive human rights violation in the world. I feel like that's old, but people have forgotten that in the US, right? Violence against women is the most pervasive human rights violation in the world, right? We're looking at other violations that intersect with it, but it still is very pervasive. Right, so we wanted the administration to keep its commitment. We wanted to, in particular, you know, we referred to commitments made by the Obama administration in the Violence Against Women Act, right? In the also in the guidances issued around gender bias policing under the Obama administration, which at this point under the administration, no one is looking at gender bias policing in the way that they should. No one is really taking the steps. We wanted for the reports to the UN committees, all of the reports to the UN Committee on the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and the Convention Against Torture, you know, to be respected. We wanted those reports to be continued to be made public. We wanted a recognition of the centrality of the rights of women of African descent within racial justice concerns of all people of African descent in this country, which we're still fighting for. We wanted a renewed focus on the mandate to increase resources for meaningful primary prevention of violence before it occurs. We wanted resources for programs that could happen at the grassroots level, which would focus on factors that impact both the risk and the consequences of sexual violence, like patriarchal systems, hypermasculinity, as we've talked about. Poverty poses a risk to women and girls as far as violence is concerned, all forms of sexual violence, including sex trafficking. Discriminatory police and overcriminalization poses a risk for women and girls in this country for increased violence. We wanted the development of really a sustainable intra-community model for harm doers to be accountable, what we were calling radical accountability, which integrated this practice and practice around transformation, right? Really included transformative processes. We really wanted to do all of these, but with this new administration, it's become more and more difficult. And so, this is the reason we are creating our own sort of community practices in spaces that are separate from what exists now. Although we are very optimistic, for example, about new system level reforms, you know, that have been proposed, like the People's Justice Guarantee, which was introduced by Congresswoman Ayanna Presley. We also are very optimistic about Representative Nydia Velasquez, for example, who introduced legislation to eliminate a controversial program that channels military-grade weapons and equipment to local and state police forces, right? To eliminate that. Some progress was made under Obama, but President Trump fully reinstated, you know, the program. So the militarization of police is still a problem that we face, right? And that we're seeing the consequences of that as police operate with impunity. So, you know, these are some of the efforts and some of the ways in which we had hoped that gendered forms of racism, gendered forms of violence, our stories, like the murder of Breonna Taylor, like the rape of the women in Oklahoma by Officer Holtzclaw in 2014, upwards of 32 women. We wanted their stories to be centered in all of this reform. What we're seeing in these proposed bills by our legislature is that gender is not centered. It continues to not be centered. And so the fight really continues. There's also a need, just last thing I will say about this is, you know, in about a decade ago, if not more, I worked on a project with community members, and it was a police precinct project, police community sort of peace building project, where we had the opportunity to sit with police officers and discuss really on a human level how we were impacted, and they had an opportunity to discuss on a human level how they were impacted, not only by the system within which they worked, but the fact that there's just such a disconnect. And progress was made. So there could be, I truly believe that there is possibility for us to build peace and to build solutions together with police as human beings themselves. They are not just simply uniforms, right? So they're human beings themselves. And many of them are people of color, and many of them are survivors of violence, right? And this is not popular, what I'm saying, right? My advocate colleagues, you know, may not agree with me. But I think if we're going to build peace, it can't be about throwing away any segment of the population, not the women in racial justice movements and not the police officers in peace building movements.
Great. Thank you, Farah. We are out of time, and so it may be that we lose a number of participants, but I did want to just allow each of the panelists an opportunity if there's any final remarks they'd like to say, because it has been such a fascinating conversation. And Farah, you've really brought it back to that beginning where there is a need for this fire and drive to change and to look at transformation and what that might be, notwithstanding all of these challenges that we see right now. And I think not just that, but also that there is value in obviously exploring, you know, a full spectrum of options around what that might look like. And I particularly think that looking at the human level, and how, in fact, if you break down institutional cultures of lack of accountability and lack of governance, it does come from a centering of humanity. And what does that mean for within the police culture? But it's a difficult culture to challenge, no doubt. So, you know, just if you have the time for a few minutes and you'd like to say some final remarks, I'd like to open the floor to any of the other panel members to share that. Yasmin, please.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, you know, coming from a country where 25 years after a transition, you know, COVID-19 has really exposed, I would say, all of the unintended consequences of not attending to racial transformation. So I would argue that I think that truth commissions to some extent can lay the foundations for change, but that change doesn't come in a short period. It's probably going to take a lifetime. But I think we also have to think about it from the perspective of, I use the word transformative justice. And that is, you know, justice which affects so many different levels, the institutional, the cultural, the individual, because I think one of the lessons around the transformation question has been that, you know, we argued as feminists that you need a place at the table. And that's the first site of struggle. But one of the things we've not been able to do successfully is to transform the cultures, whether it's in the judiciary, whether it's at a governance level, at the level of parliament or the executive, whether it's in the police or the military. And in a sense, in the last 10 years, what we have seen is an increased focus on the militarization of our societies. And I think COVID-19 has illustrated that more than anything else, that the temptation has been not to have a human approach, but rather one that is focused on enforcement and security. And we've got to change that paradigm around. And so, you know, in my view, I think it goes also to the heart of what I call the political economy. Unless the ideology of capitalism and neoliberalism, we're able to say that that's not normal and that we can't afford to go back to that situation, we're not really going to transform the lives of ordinary people. And then I think the big question is, how do you tackle an entrenched culture of masculinity, but also racial superiority? In my country, we have statistics. And what we found, I think, is that what we have not been able to chase is the racialized face of poverty and inequality. And it's a big wake-up call, given the kind of, you know, movements that are taking place across the rest of the world. But I think what we also have to say is that, to be realistic, truth commissions lay a foundation, but it's the partnerships you create and the awareness you create around the narrative that is going to bring around the advocates who are going to be the drivers of those change. And in that context, the denial and the construction of a new narrative are probably the most complex questions that a truth commission is going to have to navigate. And I think that when you look at denial, it's also about an acknowledging by those who benefited from the systemic oppression. And that's why I think, you know, when we talk about reconciliation, we also have to be careful about how we understand that language, but also unless you have an acknowledgement and a real sense of embracing that you were a part of the systemic failures and the structural oppression, you're not going to change our societies. And I think that's the hardest lesson from, you know, over the last 30 years, really, in dealing with this kind of work. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Yasmin. As you're saying all of that, I can absolutely see the parallels, you know, even with the US now and how long that journey is. Brandon and Ibtihel, any final comments? Brandon, yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, thanks everybody for really fascinating and interesting discussion. I'm not sure if I have too much to add. I think everyone's really sort of summarized quite a lot of what has been said. I suppose on some levels, though, maybe it goes without saying, I think for a lot of these things, it really is a process. And, you know, Yasmin, I think, very carefully articulated the way, you know, groups in South Africa had to push the agenda of gender to get it onto the Truth Commission. You know, now I think we know these issues have to be integrated from the start if they're to make a difference. And so there's a constant process of learning. And I liked your emphasis on, I suppose, on the evidence as well. You know, so I cited the research from Jessica Doyle and Monica McWilliams, but as much as their research shows some positive trends, it also shows now that where women felt that the police were not dealing with, for example, complaints about psychological violence in the home. So they might be picking up on more physical forms, but they didn't know how to deal with psychological violence. So, you know, that's the next challenge that maybe has to be dealt with. And equally, with any of these processes, I don't think you can take the foot off the pedal, basically. You've got to keep working at them. And I think institutions just have a way of protecting themselves and moving inward. And I think over, you know, coming from South Africa, watching and being part of our transition over decades, you see, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and it's a continual process. And it is why civil society and other groups are so important. And maybe finally, just to end off, I mean, I think I'd made the points about the importance of not being too violation centric in how we think about these narratives. And although that's a critical part of the picture, as Yasmin has also emphasized, we need to look at those much wider systemic issues. And I think we didn't have time today to really start to talk about that from an intergenerational perspective. We flagged it up, but we didn't really talk about it. And I think that that's a massively important issue. I mean, most of us coming from the backgrounds we come from, I'm very comfortable talking about the state and violations by states and by non-state actors. But, you know, increasingly we have to deal with the private sector and the way that they're part of a lot of the violence that we see in the world today, in terms of, say, communities being forced out of their homes, whether it's in Latin America or in Africa. So, you know, we have to grapple with that when we're thinking about institutional reform. And then a whole new sector of where narratives are shaped within social media. And we cannot, you know, think of what's going on in the US today and in other parts of the world without thinking of the negative influence of various influences on social media in terms of youth attitudes, in terms of race, as much as there's also positive stuff that's going on. And so I think these are the types of issues that we still have to tackle at the meta-narrative level, the sort of private sector, social media. I think we're not anywhere close to that. A lot of us have good models for state and non-state actors, but these other parts of the puzzle are more difficult to think about.
Thanks, Brandon. Ibtihel, would you like to add anything? I know that we are well and truly over time, but I know that this has been part of your organic conversation. So last words, Ibtihel? And you need to unmute your microphone again. No? No. Okay.
Thank you.
No worries. I just wanted to thank all of you for joining this discussion. You know, the intention was really to explore this quite niche topic in some ways, not just gender, not just truth-telling, but also how does it lead to institutional reform. And, you know, each of you brought such specific and deep expertise. And it's been incredibly, you know, enriching to hear from all of you and to try and trace the threads across these different contexts and the trends that we see. And so, Ibtihel, did you want to add anything? Sorry, you've still, yes? Sorry, let me interrupt myself and let Ibtihel have the last minute as well.
For Tunisia, there is many positive changes after the revolutions. And now people and women don't want to return to the dictatorship. We don't accept the return to dictatorship. And now there's many movements who defend, of course, the rights of women, rights of citizens. We don't accept at all to return back to dictatorship. Torture is refused. Now also there is many changes even in the police. We don't have the same fear as before now, because there is many programs and training for police and the police station and for the police. They know that they will be punished if they don't respect human rights. They will be resiled. And you know, social media now, all the people, they can register videos when they see policemen who try to do injustice to anyone. I think also after our work on the Truth and Dignity Commission, and our work, it doesn't finish. It was a bridge to transformative justice. Now we need to struggle more and more. The fruit will be after many years, especially, and after how to change the mentality of people, how to respect all the citizens, all religions, all the ideologies. But we need time. We need to feel what happened for all these women, for all victims, and to not accept what happened to any other citizen
in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I will in there, you're right, and certainly that's what we're all working towards. So you know, I just will end there by saying it's been an immense privilege to have you all on the panel, and I hope you've enjoyed the conversation with each other as well, the contrasting perspectives and experiences. And yes, we did not get to speak about intergenerational effects, social media, the full extent of, you know, challenging police cultures. I think that we could have well gone for another couple of hours, but thank you for the time that you have spent with us today. It's been a real pleasure, and I look forward to having conversations with all of you sometime soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.